Witches, a topic that fascinates many people. These beings have certain supernatural characteristics that make it very difficult to believe they truly exist. And they are said to exist because even today, with the urbanization of many areas of the country, there are still stories about witches. Many stories found on the web, spanning the north, center, and south of the country, share certain elements with each other. These elements give greater credibility to the idea that witches really exist, that they are not simple tales of ancient people. People in the old days truly had a great terror of these beings. The most recurring themes found in these stories are the power to transform into large deformed birds, owls, and even turkeys. Another less common variant is to transform into luminous spheres, fireballs, and the ability to fly through the skies. This does not necessarily involve using a magic broom. There are also stories of attacks on newborn children, either to abduct them or to suck their blood, and the strange rituals they perform in gatherings also known as aquelarres. Finally, and not less important, there are the rituals, talismans, and other practices that must be performed to counteract a witch. Do you remember the first time you heard about a witch? Most likely, many had contact with witches through fairy tales or even children's movies like Snow White. In Snow White, with its many colors and a beautiful background story, the character of the witch was seen as a villain, wanting to stop the plans of the protagonist by giving her a poisoned apple that would put her to sleep forever. There are stories like Hansel and Gretel where a witch lives in the depths of the forest, with the ability to turn her hut into cookies and candies, with the intention of attracting children to devour them. The image that is commonly associated with witches is imposed by popular culture: a huge pointed hat, black dress, a broom, a cauldron, a huge nose, and in some cases, green skin. All these characteristics typically adorn an old woman, a decoration that reminds us of Halloween. It should be mentioned that there are some visual differences in the reference of a witch's appearance, with European witches having the classic look of the Middle Ages and later centuries, as seen in the 1600s with the events in Zugarramurdi and Salem, perhaps two of the most iconic places regarding witch hunting. Obviously, the existence of historical accounts of these beings dates back a long time, but it was precisely in those years that it began to gain greater strength, thanks to the Church's efforts to achieve a greater presence and cleanse the pagan culture that still existed at that time. Today, all this has evolved, opening doors to a new era to shape the cult that revolves around witchcraft, making it a little more natural, as the Wicca tradition, for example, explores. But what about Latin America? And especially, what about Mexico? The folklore that adorns the stories of witches in Mexico is very rich. It seems to be regional, but there are some similarities that refer to the practices carried out by witches in Europe. Paul Sabillat, a French ethnologist, collected a great deal of information about European folklore. Stories of peasants, sailors, and others were part of his research. And, of course, the theme of witches was included. European witches could resort to animal transformation to commit their feats. The form of the hare was used in case of emergency meetings between the aquelarres. The famous rabbit's foot is considered good luck because, in theory, it had been torn from a witch who was missing. The most interesting thing about the use of the animal form of owls is that the owl has also often been associated with witches because it is a nocturnal animal with large eyes for spying and the ability to emit scathing screams, signs of heinous events. In how many stories have these animals been involved, and the famous noises that are usually heard at night? Is it just coincidence? The truth is that the stories are there, and not just one, but many. Another interesting point is related to the physical aspect of the witch, linked to the image of a grotesque old woman, living far away from towns or deep in forests, like the story of Hansel and Gretel. There is something curious about what Leonardo Samanigo mentions, that police officer from Monterrey who suffered a supposed attack by a witch a couple of years ago. When he was attacked, he noticed that the witch's features corresponded to those of a middle-aged woman, neither ugly nor beautiful. One can imagine that witches can live a very long life, and the older the age, the greater access to information and secrets. But after all, they have a natural life cycle, and it is not strange to see witches of different ages. One story mentions 3 fire spheres that were harassing a house, each with a different tone of voice. That of a very old woman, a middle-aged woman, and a young woman. Taking advantage of the theme of fire spheres, some people identify them as fatuous fires, which have a scientific explanation, but this does not mean that they are unrelated to these supernatural beings. There is a legend from Galicia about a fire in which a peasant returning home at night saw a bright light moving ahead of him. Closer, he saw that the light was a lantern carried by a small, dark figure whom he followed for several miles. Suddenly, the man found himself on the edge of a huge hill with a roaring water current running beneath him. At that precise moment, the bearer of the lantern jumped across the hole, raising the light far above his head and letting out a malicious laugh, after which he turned off the light, leaving the poor peasant far from his house, plunged into darkness and on the edge of a cliff. This is a facade worthy of a witch that occurs not in Mexico but in Europe, and which involves these mysterious spheres of fire. There is a story about a person assigned, along with some companions, to perform measurements and land surveys in an area of the Veracruz Basin. Entering an ejido sometimes requires going deep into the countryside. These people passed a lagoon and arrived at a place to do their jobs. They finished the first day and stayed to sleep in a house of one of the settlers, since the place was quite far away. It was at dawn that they heard and felt the tremors of a distant hill. It was not an earthquake, the vibration had come from that place. They went out into the complete darkness and saw 3 balls of fire, turning perfectly towards that hill until they disappeared. The next day, they asked the person in charge of being with them about what happened, but they did not say anything and acted evasive. It wasn't until the last day that, as they were about to leave, they mentioned that what they had seen had been witches. This happened about 15 or 17 years ago. This is a witch story that happened around 2000. Will witches have also adapted to today's society? They might be more careful in what they do, because if they used to live in a remote area, probably today, with urban expansion, they are no longer the only person living in that area. With the adaptation to the present days, this does not necessarily mean witches who perform witchcraft rituals, black or white. Personally, it is difficult to see the relationship they have with the witches of the stories told. Although there are interviews on YouTube that involve more ritualistic works, giving answers to the folklore that surrounds them is challenging. It is not something to be taken lightly. The ability to fly is sometimes linked to the way these beings transform into ethereal forms to terrorize and cover much more ground in their nocturnal incursions. Strange bird size and shape are a common denominator as mentioned above. While a broom is often depicted, not many stories describe Mexican witches using them. They are mentioned, but are not requirements for flight. In European folklore, witches used a large number of different ingredients to prepare their brews, potions, and ointments, the latter of which gave them the ability to levitate and reach a state of ecstasy during the celebration of the aquelarres. Mexican witches have their own folklore, so many may have heard in various legends how these beings tear off their legs and keep them, to thus be able to become owls. Perhaps this image is very characteristic of our country, since in times of the Aztecs and other pre-Hispanic civilizations, there were women who had such capacity and who were destined to do things similar to those that witches currently do. In ancient Aztec, all women born on the day of Icaltat or One Wind were known as Omatzocopinqui and were destined for a magical and lonely path because their spirit was invaded by chaos. They were created and destroyed with every step they took. They were magical, dark, and dangerous women. They were capable of great feats, summoning spirits, causing diseases and death, and even flying, changing bodies with the tecolote, tearing off their legs every night. These women were abandoned by their families when their powers were revealed to the community, as it was believed that their presence only attracted pain and darkness. Could it be that part of this data was leaked to give life to the sketch of the current Mexican witch? At this point, we know that they can become birds, fireballs, and also levitate and fly without the need for transformation. There are two short, quite curious stories about this. The first mentions a boy who was returning home very late at night. As he passed through a park, he saw an old woman sitting on one of the benches. She looked distressed, as if she had been hurt. The young man politely stopped and asked her if she was well, if something had happened to her. The old woman very calmly replied, "Yes, I'm fine. I was flying, but I forgot and I fell." The boy was shocked by the comment. He wished her good night and moved away as quickly as possible. At least in that story, the following did not happen to him. A group of boys were partying, driving around in a truck at night, relaxing and shouting at passers-by. To their surprise, when they shouted and made fun of an old woman, she pursued them a good distance at great speed, levitating. Can you imagine the scene? It was unreal, so they had to accelerate quickly to leave her behind. Not only is the speed of movement included in a witch's abilities, but also superhuman strength, which does not fit at all the profile of an old woman. They are capable of knocking down an adult man, or, as in the case of the Monterey witches, one, in a fit of anger, even broke the windshield of a car with her bare hands. All these characteristics that witches possess serve a purpose: to help them commit their acts much more easily. The theft of children and the sucking of their blood is one of the most disturbing issues that revolve around these beings. Their purpose? To suck the blood of newborns, unbaptized infants, and even devour their entrails. For this, they have the ability to put the inhabitants of a house into a deep sleep, either with a spell or something they cast, causing an extremely deep slumber from which it is difficult to awaken. These beings, or even vampires, as they are called in some cases, are not only present in Mexico when it comes to stealing or sucking children. Black Annie, a kind of witch of British origin, is an example, but there is a being who is much more faithful to the image of the witch as we know her. The Nochnitsa, or an evil spirit from Slavic mythology, has some parallels with which we can identify them with the stories of witches. It is said that it is known for tormenting children at night, and the only way to protect oneself from it is with an amulet. Mothers in some regions place knives in their children's cradles or draw a circle around them using several utensils as a measure of protection, possibly under the belief that these supernatural beings cannot touch iron. It is interesting that often the blood and entrails that little witches stole were used, according to European folklore, to make part of their potions, even feeding themselves the remains of the little ones that fell into their claws. This also brings to mind stories of witches who, the day after their misdeeds, served their husbands and their own children a dish called maranga. What these unknowing family members did not know was that the blood used to make it belong to children. Some confessions of witches in Europe state that they often stole children to raise them as their own and thus transmit their knowledge and continue the generational line. In other cases, they kidnapped children at night and took them to their rituals where they gradually made them participants, ensuring they would not speak or tell, offering them sweets, gifts, or even threats. This ensured that little by little, the child would become interested in that world, until finally they made them deny God and presented them before the devil to claim them as their own. The issue of missing minors is quite delicate, but imagine that these beings have adapted to our times, preying on children in parks, houses, or even hospitals, to perform their rituals. Rituals like the so-called aquelarres or black masses, where witches and warlocks gather around a bonfire, dancing and uniting in orgies to worship the devil, continue until the moment he appears before them to give them his blessings and start the banquet. Accounts published in 1611 about the Zugarramurdi process describe how, during the aquelarre, witches and warlocks celebrated a banquet in which corpses of recently deceased witches or victims of their evil acts were eaten, especially children. These children were buried in graves accompanied by the devil and his servants. There, they took out their guts from the graves and dismembered them, covering the grave so that the profanation would not be noticed, and returning to the site of the aquelarre. There, they cut them into pieces and divided them into 3 parts. One they gave away, another they cooked, and the third they left raw. Placed on a table with dirty and black cloths, they distributed the meat among the closest relatives, reserving the heart for the demon. Some inquisitors also confessed that they kidnapped children and sucked their blood, while the demon told them, "Suck and swallow that, which is good for you." The aquelarre ends at dawn, when the first bell rings or with the first rooster's song. It should be mentioned that this description of the aquelarres is what was given in Europe, but many things found in Mexican stories coincide. Knowing how witches act and what powers they have, how can one protect themselves from them? Many people are skeptical about the subject, but there are too many coincidences not to realize that they might exist. Older people often know about this topic. The story of the Witch of Excalic is one of those stories that clearly mentions how one can confront a witch. The Our Father prayer recited 7 times in reverse, and a ribbon or red thread, are what many people use to ward them off. It is not the first time this method has been heard. A circle of salt is also important. Salt in general is a repellent for any being of darkness. Likewise, painting or sprinkling salt on doors, windows, or under the bed are good measures to remove these beings. Cross-shaped scissors are also widely used in history, as are machetes, perhaps due to the iron. Scissors are even said to leave an immobile witch or nawal, giving the necessary time to act. Whatever the way you seek to deceive or stop a witch, remember that faith is the most important thing when doing these things. Believe it or not, it is best to be warned.